Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 10th of November 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and I'm delighted to say joining me in the studio today is Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the programme, Vanessa.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be back.
Good stuff, right? Well, we're going to get straight on with it. I think we're going to begin with Channel 4 News. This is the news team. Christian Guru Murthy and Cathy Newman, I suppose, are the main presenters these days. Jon Snow taking a relative backseat. But their coverage of Syria has not been best.
No, I mean they've been instrumental in maintaining the fabricated revolution narrative and leading the way, even perhaps more than the BBC. In demonizing and vilifying the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab Army and the Syrian state institutions by default.
Now, we're going to start off with an interview that Cathy Newman did. How many weeks ago now this is?
This would probably be over a month ago now.
And who was she speaking to?
She was speaking with Dr. Boutana Shaban, who's the political and media advisor to the President Bashar al-Assad.
Okay, so let's just...
So a senior member of the government.
Let's just have a look at this short clip and then we'll discuss it afterwards.
If there are technicalities that are being addressed in order to make sure that everything is safe, this doesn't mean that there is any hesitation on the Syrian government. After all, these are our people. And we are tired.
Yes, and your people,
excuse me,
your people are being massacred. Your people are being starved to death in Aleppo. Children, the victims of chlorine gas attacks just less than a fortnight ago.
Excuse me. My people are being massacred by Western forces' support of terrorists in Syria. Those are the ones who are massacring our people. If the United States had agreed with Russia 3 years ago to fight terrorism together, there would have been no terrorism in Syria. But it is the double standard practiced by the West regarding terrorism that is killing our people and, by the way, killing Western people, whether in Paris or Luxembourg or the United States or anywhere in Europe.
And for 5 years
of Western government.
And for 5 years, your boss, President Assad, has been massacring his own people. And less than a fortnight ago, we saw children gasping for breath after having been the victim of a chlorine gas attack.
The new technique is to talk over the top of people. It's to accuse people's bosses of gassing children. This is journalism in the 21st century?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, Channel 4, that used to have the reputation for a measured, objective, constructive reporting, has suddenly become Fox News of the UK. I mean, this is a Goebbels-style inquisition of an extremely senior member of the Syrian government. I mean, it's equivalent to Samantha Powers storming out of the UN in New York during a security meeting, emergency security meeting that they've called. I mean, it's quite extraordinary and it's shocking.
So that was Cathy Newman. What was her response to the? I have to say, at the time she received quite a backlash from people on the internet. What was her response to that?
She never responded to that. And I mean, you're right. The post itself on her page was absolutely mobbed by people who were disgusted with this style of interview. And it certainly seems, I mean, we've watched a few Channel 4 interviews by various reporters today, and it certainly seems to be the style that they're adopting to basically push their interviewee onto the ropes and then keep punching them. Here you have somebody whose English is not her mother tongue, who handles this interview extremely well, actually, and makes some very pertinent points. But what we have with Cathy Newman is somebody that rams home sound bites and narratives that have been so long discredited and debunked. It's extraordinary that they're still resurrecting them.
Now, they obviously, like most media outlets now, they run a YouTube channel where many of these reports get placed as individual reports. Well, they haven't been averse to having to take material down.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a recent situation where they put up one of their many videos from Aleppo, and it was immediately mobbed by various independent media outlets, particularly RU Videos, I think, who immediately highlighted the fact that actually, let's say Channel 4 were running with terrorists in East Aleppo. They were showcasing a group known as Nour al-Din Zinki, who were responsible of the beheading of the 12-year-old Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa, a few months ago.
And that video was taken
down? Yeah, it was taken down as soon as people sort of cottoned on to what they were doing.
Oops.
Yeah, it was taken down.
Now, of course, it isn't just Kathy Newman. Christian Guru Murthy has been producing a number of videos in the Inside Aleppo series. The first one here is up close with the what?
Well, they do say up close with the rebels, but this is actually the video that they took down. Fortunately, we managed to resurrect it. I mean, nowadays most people, are pretty clued up on this, and if there's something remotely contentious, people download it almost immediately, as I did actually. And so in this, we actually see them, as I say, showcasing Nour al-Din Zinki, terrorists that have been identified. And if we run through the photographs, in the first photograph that
well, hold on, let's just have a look at the clip first of all.
It's early morning and they're planning an attack. Their way of defending East Aleppo is to hit back by sending suicide bombers to the Syrian army. And by launching rockets into the west side of the city.
I mean, the first thing to say about this is a British journalist on British television, publicly funded television. Well, not publicly funded, publicly owned television, because of course the Channel 4 is funded by advertising, but it's a public broadcaster. And this man is dismissing suicide bombings as a way to hit back.
Well, I think even more than dismissing, he's normalizing it. I mean, this entire statement is made so nonchalantly, as if it is a legitimate form of defense to use suicide bombing. He also nonchalantly mentions that they lob a few rockets into West Aleppo. I mean, the deluge of mortar fire, explosive bullets, chemical attacks that have been happening in the last, say, 15 days has been described by people in West Aleppo on the borders as being horrendous. I mean, children being eviscerated, 15, 16 civilians in one day a couple of days ago. So, for Channel 4 to sort of, as you say, just dismiss this as almost as, well, it's fine. It's a form of defense. It's a form of attack in order to defend themselves. And of course, still propagating this idea of these fighters being moderate rebels.
So you mentioned photographs, and of course this gent with the vest on and the beard. These are quite well-known images now because they've been doing the rounds of the internet for a few weeks. But this is the person that was in the Channel 4 report, and this is the same person that was involved in the beheading of the 13-year-old boy. So
as we say, Channel 4 extraordinarily also in the video says quite blithely, well, they're majority funded and armed by Qatar and the Gulf states. And again, this is just dropped into the conversation as if this is perfectly normal, that these so-called grassroots, in inverted commas, revolutionaries should be armed and funded by states external to Syria.
And this is another image from the report, and you've got the badge
of the white helmets. Again, this is quite extraordinary. I mean, this has been, I've actually lightened this image slightly so that he's clearer to see. But this white helmet operative is clearly alongside terrorists. He's clearly alongside Nour al-Zinki operatives fighting in East Aleppo. And again, Channel 4 has just sort of glossed over this.
Okay, so again, we're seeing white helmets, which this is an issue that we've covered extensively. But again, we're seeing white helmets in the same location, mixed in amongst the terrorists.
Yes, absolutely. As a terrorist, clearly showing that they're alongside the terrorists, known terrorist brigades, accepted as terrorists, although they are still being funded by the United States, Nour al-Zinki. And if we look at this photograph on the right-hand side, you have Dr. Hamza al-Khatib. Now, he is, if you like, a Channel 4 poster boy. He's somebody that they rely upon, along with his wife, Wa'ad al-Khatib, for many of their reports from East Aleppo. Now, in this photograph, he's actually pictured with members of Fastaqim, and this is where we're back to this gangs and counter-gang situation inside East Aleppo, because Nour al-Zinki, which, as we've discussed, were the beheaders of the Palestinian child, they then splintered into Fastaqim to try and distance themselves from that video that had obviously been seen by many people across the world. But they still have the same ideology, they still have the same extremist roots, and they still have the same leadership. And so here we have yet another Channel 4 supplier of information and news from inside East Aleppo who is clearly working alongside terrorist groups.
Okay, well, let's move on with Christian then, because after he spoke to the terrorists, he then spoke to the army. Let's take a short clip from this one.
لما بيكون الإنسان له حق بهالأرض هو ابن هالبلد ما بد يعني معناها هو عنده إرادة القتال لحتى يقاتل بكل الشباب بهالأرض ويرجع يسترجع، لأنه هي الأرض هي أرض آبائنا وهي أرض أجدادنا وهي أرض مواطنينا الآمنين المحتميين ورانا المعتمدين علينا.
They seem totally convinced by the Syrian government's argument that they are not fighting political opposition but terrorists. The images seen in the west of the agony of East Aleppo do not get an airing here. Do you think of the other side as people like you? Aren't they Syrians too, just like you?
عم يحمل روسية ويقوص على أهلنا المدنيين واللي عم يقذفهم بالجرار وبالقذائف الهاون وحتى بالكلور.
So these are just poor, deluded people that are just falling for the government line, that really you should be viewing the other side as people, as human beings. They cut the heads off boys, but you should view them as human beings.
I mean, this is an extraordinary demonstration of Western supremacism, exceptionalism, arrogance. I mean, here Krishnan Gurumati has taken the protection of these soldiers. We know as a fact that if any Western reporters, Ava Bartlett has just come back from Aleppo, and she said quite clearly, if you are in an area where there is a risk of sniper fire, which is definitely where they were, these soldiers will put their body between the snipers and you in order to protect you. So we see a Channel 4 reporter here that has taken protection from these soldiers and is then basically telling them that they're living in a parallel universe. And that, I think he calls it the agony of East Aleppo. And yet again, there's complete denial of the very real agony that is being inflicted upon the civilians of West Aleppo by the terrorist brigades inside East Aleppo. There's complete sort of denial of this, dismissal of it, marginalization of this, as if this just doesn't happen. And as if the Syrian Arab Army are duty-bound to ignore the fact that their own children, later on in that actual clip, he speaks to a soldier who's just 2 days previously lost his 2 sons from the terrorist mortar fire. And yet he expects them to be able to rationalize in a battle zone the terrorist brigades. We really have to stop this narrative of rebels, because there are so few grassroots so-called moderate rebels that have not been absorbed into the Al-Qaeda leadership. or tutelage, let's say. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's just it's an extraordinary display of arrogance from Channel 4 here.
Well, what do we know about Christian himself?
Apart from, you know, he's come from a sort of a BBC background. He was trained up through the ranks of the BBC. He went to Oxford. He joined Channel 4 in '98, so he was one of the sort of founder members of Channel 4. His brother, Ravi Gurumati, worked for Dave Miliband. Now
still is, it seems, and has written articles with David Miliband on international rescue-related matters.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of background he's coming from. So maybe that gives us a clue as to why he's taking the approach that he is.
Possibly, yes. And certainly, if we go back through some of his historical interviews, like, for instance, with Robert Downey Jr., where we see an extraordinary sort of subliminal attack on somebody's, shall we say, weaknesses. And this is repeated in many of his interviews. I mean, he's certainly not, you know, there is a certain degree of aggression that can be used in journalism in order to try and provoke your interviewee into responding. But you know, at some point it becomes aggression.
Yeah. Well, Channel 4 News, their YouTube channel, this is another in the Inside Aleppo series, or it appears to be, because that is the headline on it anyway. It says Inside Aleppo, 6 children killed in Syrian shelling. But then when you watch the video, you discover that it's not Aleppo at all. It's Mosul. And in fact, the commentary explains that it's Mosul. And many of the comments underneath this video saying that this is Mosul. And yet this video has been up for a few days, and nobody seems to be interested in taking any action on it at all. And for a mainstream news outlet which pretends to present itself as a serious news outlet as it is, this is quite strange.
It's very odd. I haven't quite figured this one out, because they were so quick to take down the video that was showcasing Nur al-Zinki. And yet here we have the title saying that it's in Aleppo, the information saying it's in Damascus, and the film itself in Mosul. It's a very peculiar or very poor editing at best. Okay,
well, let's move on from Channel 4 then to other journalist-related issues. Tell us about Hadi Abdullah.
Well, basically, this guy who's a known supporter of Al-Qaeda. We've seen various tweets from him blessing Al-Qaeda fighters before they go into battle. So he's a known terrorist-supporting journalist, let's say. He's just won the Reporters Sans Frontières Freedom Award for 2016.
So this organisation, the name would suggest it's related to Médecins Sans Frontières?
It would, wouldn't it? It does actually have National Endowment for Democracy backing and Ford Foundation backing, so it's up there with the NGO complex, let's say. I haven't had time yet to look into its connections to see whether it does have any connection across to Médecins Sans Frontières, but certainly the similarities are there.
Okay, well, we have a short clip of this gentleman's reporting, so let's have a look at that and then we can comment on it in a second.
فقتل ما يقارب 14 جندي من جنود الأسد والعصابات الإيرانية التي كانت متحصنة فيه. عرض عليهم الثوار بعد محاصرتهم أن يسلموا أنفسهم فرفضوا. قتل منهم البعض والبعض الآخر ما زال على قيد الحياة تحت الأنقاض ليذوق الموت البطيء الذي أذاقه لكل السوريين. لطالما قتلونا بشكل بطيء، لطالما قتلوا أطفالنا ونساءنا تحت الأنقاض، فهم الآن يذوقون من نفس الكأس. لطالما أبكوا رجالنا ونساءنا، فالآن يبكيهم الله. يا عسكري علي صوتك، يا عسكري علي صوتك. كم واحد أنتوا؟ كم كنتوا واحد بالمبنى؟ كنتوا 14؟ 10 ماتوا ولسه 4؟ من وين أنتوا؟ من وين؟ من سلحب؟ واللي معك؟
العراقية محمد.
من العراقية؟
والشاب الثالث معه الجرر.
أشو معكم سلاح؟ أشو كنت عم تقتلوا فينا؟
ما معنا شيء والله ما معنا شيء سلاحنا ضاع.
سلاحكم ضاع ما؟
ولا كذاب؟
هلا كنت عم بتقول المخزن مليان.
وذخيرته مليانة.
وذخيرتي بس ما عندي ذخيرة.
طبيعي ما تستخدم ذخيرة بدون سلاح. ليك؟ ليش ما سلمتوا حالكم وقت لكم الثوار سلموا حالكم؟ خفتوا ما؟ طيب حالكم هيك أحلى؟
إذا بتتركنا هيك كتر خيرك.
كتر خيرها يا واطي ما؟
هلا صرتوا تعرفوا الله؟ هلا صرتوا تعرفوا الله؟ يا عسكري شو نفعك بشار الأسد أنت واللي معك؟ شو نفعكم؟ شو نفعكم بشار الأسد؟
على صوتك.
عيد. طيب نحن رح نشوف كيف رح نحاول نطالعكم ونأسركم، بس هذا اللي جنيتوه على حالكم لأنه عرضوا عليكم الثوار تسلموا حالكم ورفضتوا.
Okay, well, for people that are listening to the podcast and not watching the video, apologies. Obviously, with the podcast, you can't see the subtitles, but basically what was happening there was he was taunting some government soldiers who are buried under a load of rubble. Clearly no intention to help these people, really sort of laughing at them. You're going to die. You're going to die a long, slow death sort of thing.
Yeah.
Really pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, of course it is. And I mean, you know, this is indicative of all of these planted operatives who are working as support groups and promoters for the terrorist brigades, mercenary brigades inside Syria. And yeah, I mean, this incredible sort of humiliating taunting of injured prisoners of war. I mean, this goes against, if this is a genuine civil war, as it's described in Western media, then we should expect it to adhere to some sort of Geneva Convention as regards the treatment of prisoners of war. And we see this all the time. I mean, this again is mirrored by the behavior of the so-called first responders and humanitarian, partial, non-sectarian white helmets. You know, we see them standing astride the bodies of Syrian Arab Army soldiers and flicking the victory fee. There's no difference.
And so you mentioned he's just been given an award. What was the? Give us the details of that.
Basically, I mean, it's the Reporters Sans Frontières Freedom Award 2016. So it's in recognition of his journalism and courage under fire. And he's been congratulated by the US Embassy in Damascus. Of course, it's not actually in Damascus, but their Twitter page. So there's quite clear support coming in. Looking at 2014 tweets from this guy, from Hadi Abdullah, where he's clearly being photographed alongside Al-Qaeda leaders and fighters, and he's blessing them before they go into battle. So, I mean, you know, how many more clear indications of who exactly is supporting the various terrorist factions inside Syria we need, I don't know. And how on earth our media is completely ignoring this fact, and every single report that they do, you know, has to start pointing to their criminal implication in the crimes against humanity that are being carried out inside Syria.
Okay, well, in a moment we're going to move on to Yemen, but before we do that, what's the status of the campaign with the White Helmets? Where are we with that?
With the White Helmets, we're at the situation where obviously we derailed their bid for the Nobel Peace Prize, which was an amazing demonstration of truth to power. Great thanks to your viewers and listeners, because I think everybody made the concerted effort to really derail that, and it was fantastic. But we're now at a stage where obviously the investigations are ongoing. We are pushing for the Right Livelihood Award, which is the alternative Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded to them prior to the Nobel Peace Prize announcement. We're pushing for that to be retracted before it's actually awarded in December. So that is the current campaign, let's say, is to keep pressuring them to look at the evidence against the White Helmets, which is building on a daily basis. People now are investigating their social media accounts, their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, their individual accounts, and the evidence is building against them. So, you know, it's a question of continuing working along those lines, working with the ICDO, the International Civil Defense Organization, to try and put together an official statement basically saying that the real Syria civil defense are the recognized Syria civil defense. And also, Russia is now, after my trip to Moscow a couple of weeks ago, Russia is now much more up to date with exactly who the White Helmets are. So we expect to see a few more announcements coming out of Russia as regards their identity, their backing, their multi-million backing from NATO states. And now, of course, from Qatar, who's publicly announced that it is funding them as well. And
are we getting any major public statements from the Syrian government?
We've had Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, who's the permanent Syrian representative to the UN in New York. A few weeks ago, he made a very clear, he clearly exposed the White Helmets. He also exposed James Le Mesurier, the British ex-military mercenary trainer of the White Helmets, inside the United Nations in New York. And anybody who's been watching interviews with President Bashar al-Assad will have seen him cite the video of Hands Off Syria, where the White Helmets are described as al-Nusra with a facelift, or al-Qaeda with a facelift. So yes, fairly high-ranking officials, if not the highest ranking, as in President Bashar al-Assad, have publicly exposed them now.
And then in the last couple of days, we discovered some issues with visas.
Yes, Raed Salah, who of course is the now called president of the White Helmets after their trip to the Champs-Élysées and the Assemblée Nationale in France. Interestingly, considering that the UK is primary funder of these White Helmets and creator of this White Helmet construct, he was refused entry to the UK. He was refused a visa to the UK, which is an interesting turn of events because, of course, we know in April of this year, he was refused entry at Dulles Airport in the States. He was then allowed back into New York in September this year, and he met with Kerry when, of course, he was pushing, as a humanitarian would do, for a no-fly zone, a we bomb, you don't zone, as we call it. So, yes, an interesting development. I think we're investigating that with the Home Office.
Yes.
And should get a reply as to exactly, or try to get a reply as to why they did refuse him entry.
Yes. Okay. Okay, well, look, let's talk about Yemen then. Now, this article from The Guardian, UK accused of blocking UN inquiry into claim of war crimes in Yemen. This goes back a couple of weeks, but you wanted to mention this.
Well, I mean, I think it's very important. Yes, the situation in Yemen. We have a situation where the UN is deliberately allowing genocide in Yemen. This has been very clearly stated by Professor Francis Boyle, who's a professor in humanitarian law, a very esteemed professor of humanitarian law in the States. We're seeing a very similar situation to what happened in Iraq when the UN imposed sanctions resulted in the starvation of 500,000 children. We're seeing here a very similar situation. Resolution 2216, which is an embargo on 5 known individuals, is being exploited by the Saudi coalition to deliberately starve and blockade, from a humanitarian perspective, 27 million Yemenis. And at the 33rd, I think it is, session of the UN Human Rights Commission, the UK basically vetoed the independent international commission of inquiry that was being requested by Yemenis to go in and investigate war crimes committed by both sides, because the existing national commission is run by the fugitive ex-president Hadi and can therefore not be considered to be impartial. And so the call for an independent commission has been in existence since the beginning of the war, since beginning March 2015. The fact that the UK has vetoed this is a very clear indication of where the UK's sympathies lie, and that is with the military-industrial complex, clearly.
And this veto was a Security Council veto, was it?
It was a Human Rights Council veto, as far as I'm aware, yeah.
And then Russia Today, again, this is a couple of weeks ago, UK drafts UNSC resolution calling for immediate ceasefire in Yemen. But they don't seem to really mean that, because if there was an immediate ceasefire, they wouldn't be able to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia.
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, this is very similar to the United States continuously calling ceasefires in Aleppo because it's not happy that the Russian-Syrian alliance is making advances against, of course, their proxy forces on the ground. What we're seeing here is yet another proxy war to a huge extent, with the UK and the US and France actually predominantly supplying the arms to the Saudi coalition. And so therefore calling for a ceasefire, what it really means, because we know just as the US-backed terrorists inside Syria will never respect a ceasefire, the Saudi coalition has never respected a ceasefire in Yemen or against Yemen. And so therefore what it fundamentally means is that the various resistance fighters should lay down their weapons and allow Saudi Arabia to bomb them into oblivion. That's the translation of this agreement, basically.
Yeah. And you mentioned the number of children dying of starvation in Yemen. It is incredible to me that this conflict and the effects of this conflict is getting no coverage in the mainstream media in this country, and the awareness amongst the general public about what's going on in Yemen is pretty low.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, and you know, we look at these images. I mean, this was, I think, a teenage girl. But again, going back to these UN sanctions, and of course, we have to recognize that the 3 permanent members of the Security Council are the primary arms suppliers to the Saudi coalition, France, the UK, and the United States. So very obviously, the UN has a vested interest in working with the Saudi coalition to collectively punish the Yemeni people. 10,000 children that we know of, probably more now, have died from treatable diseases, for example. The Saudi bombing of the funeral hall a few weeks ago, which massacred over 100 and left hundreds wounded. Now, those wounded, actually, the numbers of dead were over 500, I think, in the end. And many more wounded. And those wounded, I was told by people in Sana'a who were actually there, they said, but these people are bleeding to death in the streets because the hospitals are so overwhelmed. They have no equipment, they have no means of treating these people.
And this is why the death toll was so high in
there,
because
absolutely, yes.
Actually, 500 people didn't die in the bomb itself. These people died from infections and bleeding.
Absolutely, but also, Mike, I mean, this was a double tap strike. So in other words, they hit first of all when the relatives and the families, because as I said, this was a funeral wake actually for one of the most important tribal families in the region. So they knew that there would be large numbers of very important families at this funeral and followers. So it was a deliberate strike. I was told it was a deliberate revenge strike because the Ansarullah fighters had hit Saudi bases in Marib a week previously. But this was a retaliatory strike against citizens. And another important point to make, and explains again why the UK is being so reticent to actually step in and do anything positive in Yemen. We have to understand that US and UK military advisors are in the command and control center in Riyadh. and they are assisting on the choice of targets. In other words, they're perfectly aware of what targets are being hit by Saudi Arabia with their bombs, whether it's the cluster bombs from the United States or whether it's the various other weaponry from the UK.
So we're there helping them target an event like this, and then we tell the Saudis to just go ahead and investigate their own actions and don't, because we don't want any independent.
And we run a vote swap to elect them to the Human Rights Council panel. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, really, our government in Yemen has the blood of all the Yemeni people on its hands, and there's no clearer way to say that.
Now, we mentioned this on the news programme at the time. This is going back to mid-September or so, a communique on the situation in Yemen. And the sub-headline here is the foreign ministers of the UK, USA, Saudi Arabia and the UAE met to reaffirm their commitment to a resolution to the conflict in Yemen. What struck me about this and all the various other government announcements on this is that they absolutely leave out and refuse to acknowledge the existing government in Yemen, and what a lot of people don't realize, and what is, again, even when Yemen is covered, this aspect of it is left out. Yemen actually has blossoming institutions being built at the moment.
Yeah.
It has a government. Had he left the country, and
he resigned twice.
Right.
I mean, this has to be very clear. The entire UN resolution 2216 is based upon the legitimacy of President Hadi. Now, Hadi resigned twice. He resigned. One thing, his mandate had been overextended. It had been extended a year beyond what it should have been. He resigned twice from his own post before he fled, eventually via Aden to Riyadh, and demanded that Saudi Arabia bomb his own people.
So he's left the country.
Yeah.
In the meantime, the country has started rebuilding its own institutions.
Absolutely.
But from Saudi Arabia or wherever he is, he then demands to become president again.
Yeah.
And every one of these, we must have peace in Yemen communiques, says we've got to get everybody together except for the people that have established these institutions, because that's not the officially recognized government.
Which is an extraordinary stance. I mean, it's a completely, it's a criminal stance. I mean, yes, you know, you've mentioned the British government, and if we quote from Tobias Ellwood, Minister for the Middle East, I'm very concerned by the continued steps being taken by the Houthi and Salah alliance inside Yemen. Now, if you want me to talk through the actual government, the process that they've gone through in order to establish that government, I can do.
Can we do that quickly?
Yes, I can try and do it very quickly. I was speaking with Mohammed Al-Wazir, who is a US Yemeni lawyer who I worked with in the UNHRC. Now, he explained to me the full process. I'm going to have to use my notes at this point. But basically, this Supreme Political Council has been elected via a parliamentary quorum.
Sorry, did you use the E word there? Elected?
Yes.
Right.
Extraordinary, isn't it? Now, the number required under Yemeni constitution, Mohammed can correct me later if I've got this wrong, but the number to satisfy the parliamentary quorum is 138. 152 MPs, members of parliament in Yemen, were present. And among those 152 were 5 Southerners and 3 Islahis. Now, the Islahis are the Muslim Brotherhood. So here we're seeing this is not...
This is not just one side.
No, this is not a sectarian.
Yeah.
This is a coalition of all of the resistance factions against Saudi occupation of Yemen, or proxy occupation of Yemen. There were MPs stuck outside Yemen, prevented from re-entering Yemen by the Saudi coalition, but they also stated that they would have voted in favor of the Supreme Political Council. The resolution blessing the establishment of the SPC was adopted by consensus, another word that, you know, our government is not too au fait with.
Yeah.
And basically, the SPC represents the executive branch. Judiciary and parliament are separate. So now there are 3 functioning branches of government inside Yemen. Before that, parliament was hung and there was no executive in place. So the SPC is in charge of managing affairs of the country and defending the state from aggression. It's a 10-member council. headed by Salah al-Samad, 5 members from the GPC, which is the General People's Congress, which is Ali Abdullah Saleh's party, and 5 members are from Ansarullah. So we're seeing a clear coalition.
Again, not sectarian.
Absolutely not sectarian. The SPC then chose a prime minister to run the affairs of the country, Dr. Abdul Aziz bin Habtoor. And quote from Mohammed al-Wazir, when Yemenis negotiate among themselves without external meddling, they choose someone with the required skill set and network to stabilize the situation in their country, not someone who calls for war with his own people.
So we have a constitution, we have elected MPs, we have effectively a cabinet type situation, we have a prime minister. That's called a government, isn't it?
Generally, yes.
Interesting. Okay, well, so what happens next?
Well, I mean, next, we're in a situation now. And by the way, millions of people, this wasn't some Photoshop Arab Spring imagery presented by our own media and governments. Millions of people in Sana'a, in the capital in Yemen, took to the streets in support of this coalition government. And actually, I think what really worried, let's say, UK, US, and France, of course, was at this point, Russia and Iran could actually step in and start negotiating with a strong government inside Yemen. So I think this is what has basically, sent particularly the UK into a flat spin. Saudi Arabia, the UK represents 60% of Saudi Arabia's imports. So even without the military-industrial complex, Saudi Arabia is a huge trade representative for the UK. 5.6 billion pounds worth of UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia, I think, since the beginning of the conflict with Yemen.
Although that's since May 2010.
Right.
That article from The Independent says 5.6 billion pounds. But are they having it all their own way?
No, there is an independent law firm, Lee Day, which is representing the campaign against arms trade, began formal legal action in the High Court to challenge the government's decision to export arms to Saudi Arabia. I think this was back
This is March 2016,
I was just going to say.
So that process continues?
As far as I'm aware, that process is continuing.
Okay, well, so that's bringing us reasonably up to date with Yemen.
Yeah.
What's next for you? United Nations?
United Nations. Oh, yes, sorry. I'll be heading out to the United States, if they allow me in.
Yeah.
Towards the end of November. And myself and Ava Bartlett, who's just returning from Aleppo right now. She's in Damascus, I think. We'll be speaking at the UN in New York at the invitation of Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, the permanent Syrian representative at the UN, on our findings from our time in Syria. So that should be quite interesting. I think the US Peace Council, with whom I entered Syria at the end of July, are also organising a series of talks and conferences across the States. I'll be there for about 3 weeks, as I say, if they do actually let me in.
Okay, fantastic. And just before you go there, of course, you'll be at the British Constitution Group Conference in Winchester on the 19th of November. Do you know what you're speaking about?
I'm speaking about the British government role against Syria.
And deep state stuff?
Deep state,
Yes.
the building of the shadow state, which I would say Britain is definitely the primary intelligence behind the building of the shadow state in Syria.
Okay. Well, look, Vanessa, thank you very much once again. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank everybody for joining us today. We'll be back at the usual time tomorrow, 1 p.m. With David Scott, as usual. Thank you. Bye-bye.